The Arizona desert was silent, except for the slow rhythm of hoofbeats on dry earth. The sun hung low in the sky, turning the red mountains and endless sand into a glowing sea of gold. Daniel Carter rode slowly along the dusty trail, his wide hat pulled low over his eyes to block the fading sunlight. After weeks on a long cattle drive, he was finally heading home. The quiet of the desert usually brought him peace, but that evening something felt different. A faint sound drifted across the canyon. Daniel lifted his head and listened carefully. At first, he thought it was only the wind moving through the rocks. But then he heard it again, a cry. A desperate cry for help. He tightened the reins and turned his horse toward the narrow canyon where the sound had come from. As he rode closer, the echo of cruel laughter carried through the still air. Daniel's heart began to pound. When he reached the edge of the canyon, the sight before him made his blood run cold. 3 rough-looking outlaws had surrounded a young Apache girl. She looked frightened and exhausted, her dark hair tangled and her clothes covered in dust. She tried to run toward the open desert, but one of the men grabbed her arm and shoved her back toward the others. They laughed as if the whole thing were a game. Daniel felt anger rise inside him. He knew men like these, ruthless. Bandits who roamed the frontier looking for easy prey. Most travelers would have turned around and ridden away. 3 armed outlaws against 1 cowboy was not a fair fight. But Daniel Carter had never been the kind of man who ignored someone in danger. Slowly, he pulled his rifle from the saddle and rode down into the canyon. The sound of his horse caught the outlaws' attention. They turned and stared at him with surprised expressions. One of them smirked, clearly amused that a lone cowboy had interrupted them. "Let the girl go," Daniel said firmly, his voice calm but strong. For a moment the desert fell silent. Then the outlaws burst into laughter. "Well now," one of them said mockingly, reaching for his gun. "Looks like we've got ourselves a hero." Daniel's grip tightened around his rifle. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. In the next heartbeat, everything exploded into chaos as the first gunshot shattered the silence of the canyon. The gunfire faded as the last of the outlaws disappeared into the rocky hills, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they fled. The canyon slowly fell silent again, broken only by the sound of Daniel Carter's horse breathing heavily. After the sudden chaos, Daniel kept his rifle raised for a moment longer, watching the direction the bandits had escaped. Men like that rarely gave up easily. When he was sure they were gone, he lowered the rifle and turned his attention to the girl. She had collapsed onto the ground, her body shaking from fear and exhaustion. Up close, Daniel could see that she was very young, perhaps 16 or 17. Her face was smudged with dirt, and there were small scratches on her arms from struggling against the outlaws. Daniel slowly stepped closer, careful not to frighten her. "It's all right," he said gently. "They're gone." For a moment she looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. She didn't move, as if she was trying to decide whether he was truly different from the men who had captured her. Finally, she accepted the hand he offered and allowed him to help her stand. They moved to the shade of a large rock where Daniel gave her some water from his canteen. She drank carefully, still watching him with cautious curiosity. After a few minutes, she spoke softly. "My name, Ayana." Her English was slow but clear. Daniel nodded. "Daniel Carter." For a while they sat quietly while the sun dipped lower in the sky. The desert air began to cool, and long shadows stretched across the canyon floor. Eventually, Ayana gathered the courage to explain what had happened. She told him the outlaws had attacked her while she was traveling near the edge of the desert. They had captured her and planned to take her far away. At first, Daniel assumed they wanted money, but when she revealed the truth, he felt a wave of surprise. Ayana was not just an ordinary Apache girl. She was the daughter of Chief Nantan, the leader of a powerful Apache tribe that lived deep in the mountains beyond the desert. The outlaws had planned to use her as a hostage and demand a huge ransom from the tribe. Daniel leaned back against the rock, absorbing what she had said. Returning her safely would mean traveling deep into Apache territory, lands where strangers were often treated with suspicion. But leaving her alone in the dangerous desert was unthinkable. As the sky turned orange and purple above the canyon, Daniel finally stood and prepared his horse. "We should move before those men come back," he said. Ayana nodded quietly. Neither of them realized that the journey ahead would be far more dangerous than the fight they had just survived. The journey across the desert was long and exhausting. For 2 days, Daniel Carter and Ayana traveled through harsh land, where the sun burned during the day and the cold wind crept in after sunset. Daniel shared what little food and water he had, making sure the girl stayed strong enough to continue. Ayana rarely complained, but the fear in her eyes showed that she knew the danger was not over yet. Daniel also knew the outlaws might still be searching for them. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially if they believed they could still profit from kidnapping the daughter of a powerful Apache chief. By the second evening, the landscape began to change. The wide, empty desert slowly turned into rocky hills and tall red cliffs. Ayana looked around with growing relief. "We are close," she said quietly. Daniel felt both hopeful and uneasy. He had heard many stories about Apache lands. Most settlers believed outsiders were not welcome there. Still, he had promised himself he would see the girl safely home. They continued moving through a narrow pass between 2 cliffs. The wind whistled through the rocks, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains ahead. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. Then suddenly Ayana stopped. Daniel noticed it too. The strange silence. Before he could react, figures appeared from behind the rocks and high ledges around them. In seconds, a group of Apache warriors surrounded them. Their movements were swift and silent, like shadows appearing from nowhere. Each warrior held a bow with an arrow already drawn. The sharp tips were pointed directly at Daniel. His heart pounded, but he knew reaching for his rifle would be the worst thing he could do. Slowly, he raised his hands to show he meant no harm. The warriors' faces were stern and watchful. To them, Daniel was simply another white stranger riding into their land with weapons. And strangers could mean danger. One of the warriors stepped forward, speaking in a strong voice in the Apache language. Before Daniel could even try to explain, Ayana suddenly stepped between him and the warriors. She began speaking quickly in their language, her voice filled with urgency. The warriors looked surprised as they listened. Their eyes shifted between Ayana and Daniel. Finally, one of them lowered his bow slightly. Within minutes, Daniel was escorted toward the tribe's camp, still surrounded by the watchful warriors. Smoke from cooking fires rose in the distance as they approached a valley filled with tents and horses. At the center of the camp stood a tall man with a powerful presence. Chief Nantan, his sharp eyes focused on Daniel, silently judging the cowboy who had arrived with his daughter. The Apache camp was alive with movement as Daniel Carter was led through the valley surrounded by warriors. Fires burned between the tents, and families watched quietly as the stranger passed by. Some people looked curious, while others watched him with deep suspicion. Daniel could feel their eyes following every step he took. At the center of the camp stood a tall man with strong features and calm but powerful eyes. His presence alone commanded respect. Daniel knew immediately that this was Chief Nantan. Ayana rushed forward the moment she saw him. "Father!" she cried. The chief's serious expression softened for the first time as he embraced his daughter tightly. For a moment, the entire camp seemed to pause, relieved to see that she had returned safely. After the embrace, Ayana began speaking quickly in the Apache language, explaining everything that had happened. As she spoke, Chief Nantan's gaze slowly turned toward Daniel. The chief studied him carefully, as if trying to see the truth inside the cowboy's heart. Daniel stood quietly, unsure what would happen next. He knew that many tribes did not trust outsiders, and he could hardly blame them. When Ayana finished speaking, the chief stepped closer. "You saved my daughter," he said in steady English. Daniel nodded slightly. Anyone would have done the same. But the chief did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around at the gathered warriors and elders who had begun forming a circle around them. They spoke among themselves in low voices, clearly debating what should happen to the stranger who had entered their land. Before the discussion could continue, a young scout suddenly ran into the camp, breathing heavily from the long ride. He spoke urgently to the chief. The mood of the camp changed instantly. Ayana turned to Daniel, her face filled with concern. "The outlaws," she said quietly. "They are coming." The same bandits who had kidnapped her had gathered more men. They were riding toward the Apache camp, hoping to take her back by force or attack the tribe itself. The warriors quickly prepared for battle. Horses were brought forward, rifles were loaded, and bows were strung tight. Daniel realized something important in that moment. The outlaws had followed their trail. Without thinking twice, he stepped forward. "Those men are dangerous," Daniel said firmly. "If they're coming here, I'll help you stop them." Some warriors looked uncertain, but Chief Nantan watched Daniel closely. The cowboy had already risked his life once for Ayana. Soon they would see if he was willing to do it again.